There is a lot that the United States owes to Elizabethan England when Queen Elizabeth ruled in the 1600s. It was England that started the Anglican and later the Episcopal Church, William Shakespeare, and the modern English language. It was also England that started the first English town in America, which was called Roanoke and opened in 1585. Many Elizabethan rules were thrown out when the United States was being founded and when it was being colonized. England in the Elizabethan era did not care about freedom and justice for everyone. Early American residents knew this set of laws, and many of them tried to get away from its harsh rules because they were being persecuted for their religion. The Tudors' rules are strange, funny, invasive, and made up on the spot. But these laws did have a reason for being there, and they were popular at the time. Here are the strangest rules that England had in Elizabethan times. A medieval relic saved literate men. In the past, the English church kept its courts private. According to Britannica, churchmen who were charged with a crime could use the benefit of clergy to get a trial in an ecclesiastical court where punishments were less harsh. Their ability to read the Latin form of Psalm 50:51, proving that they were a priest. Nevertheless, there was a clear flaw. This benefit could also be claimed by any man who learned Latin or remembered the verse. By the time of Elizabeth I, the loophole had been written down, so all literate men could gain. The expansion changed the rules so that a death sentence could be commuted. Benefit of clergy was a legal system in Elizabethan times that kept a criminal from getting the death punishment after they were sentenced, but did not erase their criminal record. The Statute of Unpardonable Offences of 1575 said that convicts could instead be locked up. The defendant's thumb would be marked with the first letter of his act to make sure he would always remember it, so that criminals wouldn't abuse the law. They could only use it once, with the brand serving as proof. Even though the rules seemed to set up a two-tier system that favoured the educated and wealthy, it was still a step forward. The judges could soften the harsher rules of the realm, which showed that the state was kind, so that the worst criminals like burglars and arsonists would be punished. The law from 1575 said that these men could not get help from the church. Luxury was limited to nobles and courtiers. As trade in luxury goods grew because of better connections with Asia and the United States, Queen Elizabeth complained that more and more expensive things were being bought by English people. Elizabeth strengthened past sumptuary laws with a new law in 1574. She did this because she saw serviceable young men wasting their families' money. The law said that only nobles could wear expensive clothes. Dresses, skirts, spurs, swords, hats, coats, and other clothes could not have silver, gold, pearls, satin, silk, damask, or other materials on them unless they were worn by lords. It also put a funny cap on how much courtiers could spend. For example, women could spend up to £100 on skirts. Men were given £40 to spend on coats and jackets, and this money was kept in a book called the Subsidy Book. If you broke the rule in 1574, you could go to prison, pay a fine, or lose your job. Early modernists say that in 1565, a man named Richard Whalewin was jailed for wearing grey socks. A lawyer who went before the Privy Council was disbarred because he was carrying a sword with too many decorations on it. It was also hard for actors who played nobles and kings in plays. Elizabeth let actors off the hook during performances so they wouldn't get arrested for wearing clothes that were too fancy for them. This was a clear sign that the rules made more problems than they solved. The law from 1574 was an Elizabethan prestige law meant to keep things in order and keep new lords from getting too big for their britches, according to Cassidy Cash, a Shakespeare researcher. The rule was sometimes enforced against the nobility, but it's not likely that it had much of an impact on the lower classes. Pants, ruffs, and words were regulated by the crown. One of the laws Richard Whalewin broke was this one from 1562, outrageous great pair of hose. It said that hosiers could only use 1.5 yards of fabric in each pair of pants they made. People who wore hose with more cloth than this would be fined and put in jail. It was also against the rules to have double ruffles on the arms or neck, and the blades had to be a certain length and size. The law says that men started bringing weapons of a certain type, not for self-defense but to hurt and kill, which makes it seem like the ban on weapons of a certain length was meant to keep the Queen safe. The monstrous and outrageous greatness of hose, which was probably a reference to padding the legs to make them look better shaped, gave the Crown a chance to make a lot of money. When people broke these rules, they got some of the harshest fines ever. Margaret Wood of the Library of Congress says that the rule, like most of these, was an Elizabethan way to make money because people owed money directly to Her Majesty. Anyone from the government who was caught breaking these rules would have to pay a 200-mark fine. 1 mark equals 67 pence. In 1558, this was worth about £550, which is about $67,000 today. For most people, this is a lot of money. Tailors and hosiers were fined £40, which is about $20,000 today, and lost their jobs. This was a good reason to follow the law, since being unemployed was against the law. Horses should not be neglected because of clothes. Queen Elizabeth noticed that the poor people in England were wearing too much clothing, which made the horses in bad shape. This order, from 1562 via the Elizabethan sumptuary statutes, said that the sumptuary rules that Elizabeth and her predecessors had made should be followed. But then the law quickly changes the subject to horse breeding and tells police to follow the rules and punishments for exporting and breeding horses in the realm. There are probably other laws being talked about here as well, but the connection between the clothing rules and horse breeding is not clear at first. The most strange parts of the law are in the last few lines. Elizabeth wanted regional committees to be set up to decide who should not be involved in horse breeding because of neglect. The funny part of the law then says that people who didn't take care of their horses because their wives were cheap would not be able to breed horses. The law said that these committees would stay in place until Elizabeth said that the realm had enough horses. From the point of view of military readiness, the worries about horse breeding and the quality of horses make sense, but the connection to the clothing statute seems random, and since there are no penalties mentioned, it's not clear how this law could be enforced unless it was in front of the Queen, a council, or other high-level official.
You needed a license to beg. England was poor in the Renaissance because of the War of the Roses in 1485 and the Tudors' support for the Reformation. Neil Rushton, a historian, says that when monasteries were closed and the Catholic Church was banned, England's charitable organisations were destroyed. This meant that the government had to take over social aid. Britannica says that between 1485 and 1600, England's population doubled, rising from 2 million to 4 million. Nobles kicked out renters for enclosures, even though the population was growing. This caused poor people from the countryside to move to cities without any rights, and St. Thomas More's book, Utopia, says they had no choice but to beg or commit crimes. The Vagabond Act of 1531, which made idle beggars who were able to work illegal, was Henry VIII's response to the rise in begging. More kindly, poor people who were sick, broken, or old were seen as deserving beggars who needed help. Donations to churches were used as a very basic safety net. Rich people who were sturdy and wouldn't work were whipped until they bled while they were tied naked to the end of a cart. In 1547, Edward VI passed a law that made begging a crime punishable by slavery. With the Vagabond Act of 1572, one of many poor laws made by Elizabeth I, Parliament brought back the law from 1531 without the 1547 provision. Justices of the peace could give begging passes to deserving poor people under the law. This way, the government could keep society together while still helping people in need. But people who were stubbornly poor were now punished by being poked in the ear with a hot iron stick.
Rogue, vagabond, and sturdy beggars meant more than the idle poor. The UK Parliament says that the Vagabond Act of 1572 dealt with both itinerants and poor people who lived on the streets. During the Renaissance, England had a moving class of con artists, peddlers, theatre groups, jugglers, minstrels, and people with many other low-class jobs. Because these people were low-class, They were put in the same group as con artists who participated in absurd sciences and crafty and unlawful games or plays. In this group were also masterless men, or people who did not work for a nobleman with the rank of baron or higher. Examples of these people were fencers and bear wards. A third group is made up of Oxford and Cambridge students who were caught begging without the right permissions from their schools. People who broke the rules were punished the same way sturdy beggars were. Their auricular cartilage was burned. These people could still do their jobs, usually for a year, if two different justices of the peace gave them permission, even though some of what they were doing was legal. People who left their shires early were punished. Repeat offences were not punishable by death, but justices of the peace were forced to give people 40 days to change their minds after the first punishment. If the crime happened again after 40 days, the person would be put to death and all of their possessions would be given to the state.
You had to attend church. Because of an unstable religious environment, Elizabeth tried to get everyone to agree with the Church of England, which was run by the government. Peter Marshall, a scholar, says that Elizabeth didn't make many changes to the old Roman rite. The only thing she did was make Latin Mass illegal. The new rules made Puritans and Catholics very angry, and they fought them hard. Catholics wanted to get back together with Rome, while Puritans wanted to get rid of all Catholic parts in the church, or what the Elizabethan author John Field called popish abuses. The Elizabethan settlement was meant to end these issues and make everyone follow Anglicanism. It was passed by the government in 1559 along with a number of other rules. Because of the Act of Uniformity, everyone had to go to church once a week or get a 12-pence fine. The act was smart because it didn't directly support any one church. Instead, all churches in England had to use the Book of Common Prayer. This book was specifically made for an English state church that looked Catholic, which Puritans didn't like, but was separate from the Catholic Church, which Catholics didn't like. So, it was against the law to go to any church that wasn't under the Queen's control. This made the law effectively a defense of the Church of England. Many people became Anglican, which got rid of the problem of Catholicism, but some Puritans were unhappy and became more violent. Tensions were kept in check by the Act of Uniformity and the laws that went with it, but they would finally burst and lead to the English Civil War in 1642.
Conceived a child out of wedlock? That's a paddling. During the baby boom of the 1570s, there were a lot of unplanned births in Elizabethan England. Since having sex before marriage was against the law, it stands to reason that any children born outside of marriage would have the stain of bastardry and should be punished by their parents. Usually, a couple could get married to make up for their sins, and if they got married early enough, they could hide the fact that they were pregnant before they got married. During the Reformation, the Puritans changed that. Harris Friedberg of Wesleyan says that under Elizabeth, marriage did not wash away the sin. Any child born too soon after a wedding could be used as proof that the parents cheated on their spouses. If a couple got pregnant without being married, both parents were severely smacked until blood was drawn. Marriage could lessen the sentence. For example, the guilty could be led through public with the crime written on a sign in front of jeering crowds. Church rules, on the other hand, applied to the English nobility as well as everyone else. The top religious court in the Church of England, the Court of High Commission, never found anyone not guilty. Most of the people they found not guilty were adulterous aristocrats. Nobles were given less harsh punishments, but they were still not ideal. Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and Anne de Vavasour, one of Elizabeth's maids of honour, had a son together. Both of them were sent to the Tower of London to serve time. Even so, these rules didn't stop a young William Shakespeare from having a child without being married when he was 18. Questioning the Queen's children's legitimacy was treason. Average people had to follow most church rules, but Queen Elizabeth made sure those laws didn't apply to her. The record shows that Elizabeth never got married or had children. There isn't strong proof that she slept with her male courtiers, but Robert Steddle says that Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was her boyfriend. Still, succession was a worry. The Queen was the target of plans, rebellions and invasions, so her sudden death would have made the Catholic Mary of Scotland Queen. Of course, Elizabeth could not officially have children if she did not get married, right? It's not clear. The Treasons Act of 1571 said that anyone who said or wrote that someone other than Elizabeth's natural issue was the real ruler would be jailed and lose their property. Since the word lawful is missing, historians, including Thomas Regnier, have read the law as letting jerks inherit. Regnier says that the argument doesn't matter. Parliament and the Crown could legalize scum like Elizabeth and her half-sister Mary, which was an easy way to avoid problems that would have led to a brutal beating for anyone else. The law shows that the royal family has different rules for themselves than for everyone else. When the royal family broke the law, they couldn't be held responsible. But this was Tudor England, so legal fraud was normal. Heroes wear caps. People who have played the ancient simulation game Crusader Kings 2 will remember the Pants Act, which says that people in the player's realm can't wear pants. Even though this law is clearly ridiculous, rules like it existed in Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. The Cap Act of 1570 was passed by Parliament in Elizabethan England. It was the opposite of the Pants Act. People over the age of 6 had to follow this law and wear a knit woolen cap on holidays and the Sabbath. Only nobles were free from this rule. In this case, the rule was a classic example of special interests, in this case the Cappers Guild. The Crown honoured the Cappers Guilds by making everyone buy their goods. This was because the law said that the guilds gave jobs to England's poor, which cut down on homelessness, poverty, and other bad things that came with those conditions. The V&A says that each cap had to be knit, thickened, and dressed in England by someone in the trade or science of the cappers. This kept foreign cappers from competing with English cappers. The Cappers Guild then had a national hold on making caps, which must have been good for the wool industry's bottom line. At the same time, the Crown made sure it could get money from people who broke the act by imposing a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence per violation. Beards were allegedly taxed. Author William Andrews wrote a book in 1904 called At the Sign of the Barber's Pole, Studies in Hirsute History. It says that around 1535, Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, started taxing men based on how long their beards were. People say that Elizabeth I taxed beards that were longer than 2 weeks at a rate of 3 shillings and 4 pence. Sadly, it's not clear if this law existed at all. Researcher Alan Withy of the University of Exeter says it didn't. In other sources, though, these kinds of laws are talked about during the Tudor age, and they would have fit in with Elizabeth's reign. There were beard taxes in other places. In the early 1700s, Russia was trying to become more like the West, and Tsar Peter the Great taxed beards to get people to cut them. But England's legal records don't have any proof of this. The claim comes from the Encyclopaedia Britannica from 1893, which Andrews quotes almost word for word. The Encyclopaedia Britannica also says that the sheriffs of Canterbury, who worked for Elizabeth's half-brother Edward VI, around 1554 to 1556, were paid to wear beards. Britannica talks about the Oxford Magazine notes and queries, but doesn't say what issue it is. The Bergmote Book of Canterbury is also mentioned, but that's where the trail ends. What about this law? If it did, it hasn't been found yet, but it would have been one of the strangest rules of the time. Why were these laws necessary? You could say that Elizabeth's strange and seemingly silly laws were caused by tyranny, fear, or a desire for power, but you have to look at them in the context of their time. It was not safe to live during the so-called Elizabethan Golden Age. According to the World History Encyclopedia, the English Reformation totally changed England's social, economic, and religious landscape. It split the nobility into Catholic, Puritan, and Anglican groups. On the outside, Elizabeth had to deal with claims to the English throne from Spain, France, and Scotland. On the inside, many of her own lords didn't like her because she was Protestant, or the wrong kind of Protestant. The Rising of the North, an uprising of Northern Catholic lords who wanted to put her cousin Mary of Scotland on the throne, happened in 1569. The Catholic Babington Plot, also for Mary, happened in 1586, and the Spanish Armada happened in 1588. In order to keep things from getting too unstable, Elizabeth had to make as much money as possible, even if that meant making up new crimes. She also had to keep Parliament from getting too powerful by using symbolic sumptuary laws, adultery laws, and other tools. Since England was at war elsewhere, the Queen could not afford for trouble at home. Because of this, it made sense to tightly control movement, religion, and morality in public. She couldn't take the chance of causing trouble within the crown that would weaken its power. These rules increased the power of both the royal family and the church. This made the Queen stronger and let her focus on protecting England and her throne from the many threats she faced.